Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. In my last video, I built this little chase scene squig diorama. So this time, my mission is to just paint it. Luckily, I had the foresight not to stick these models down last time, so I'm able to peel them off and paint those separately. In the previous video, I did mention that my reference for this piece was Zion National Park in the USA, and that's still the colour scheme that I'm going to be going with. The little marks left behind where the models were stuck on will be a good reminder of where I should put them, but they'll also get covered up by all the painting steps that I do subsequently. I also mentioned in the last part that I ran out of primer, so my first step here is that I have to use a bit of brush on primer to just fill in some of the gaps and some of the bits I missed because I didn't have enough in my spray can. I wanted to quickly mention that for the colours of the models, I'm going to be sticking to canon colours for the normal sort of box art that these models feature. So we're going to have red squigs, and I'm going to have a green and beige Cadian. When it comes to priming, I tend to prefer to do it with a spray can where I can, but for tiny little parts and jobs like this kind of brush on primer is pretty useful. Now it's time to put the models aside and focus solely on the base first. I carefully chose a really nice gradient of paints that I'm going to use for this, and those paints are light brown and orange brown from Vallejo Model Color, as well as grunge brown, dark flesh tone and charred brown from Vallejo Game Color. And you can see here that they make a really nice orangey brown gradient. So all I really had to do was start with the darkest color, charred brown, add that all over the base, and then work up all of my other colors slowly and meticulously, adding them to the edges and just making the surfaces brighter as I go. This diorama is much bigger than the typical bases I would be painting, so I really struggled to find a good brush that I could use that was big enough to cover this surface quickly. Luckily, I did have one big flat basing brush from Citadel that I could use just to throw down this base coat brown all over the whole thing. I definitely need to pick up some bigger brushes and then I could do this a bit quicker next time. So now that the first base coat's down, it's still a bit patchy and I'm going to need to do a second coat to make sure that I get good coverage. It's always a good idea to test your paint schemes on something big like this before you commit hours of work to doing something over the whole thing. So I'm just going to take this little rock at the front and I'm basically just going to test all of my paints together on this one to see what they look like. So I'm starting with that next step up, which is dark flesh tone. And I think it's going to be really cool to see how this rock stands out from all the rest and how each layer adds a whole new dimension as I go. So the next colour up is grunge brown and I'll add that, and each layer I'm adding a smaller amount so that there's definitely still a little bit of the previous layer visible. And then the next layer was to use orange brown from Vallejo Model Color, and I was being really selective here as to where I put this, making sure that there was still some of that grunge brown showing. I'm not the best at it, but this kind of layering is all about how much of the other layers are still visible as you go, but making sure your layer is still big enough that there can be an even brighter highlight on top of it. And that's what I did next. I took the light brown from Model Color and I added it to all the edges, pretty much like anyone would do a chunky highlight. And with the test rock finished, I was quite happy. So now it's just time to apply that to every single rock over the whole rest of the structure. And this did take me a while. Well, I don't know, it was about 1 day's paint session for me, which is probably about 5 to 6 hours, which may seem like a little or a lot depending on how you paint, but I didn't think it was that bad for me. As I built up my layers, I did use some kind of dry brushing, overbrushing-y techniques, but I really liked the control I had by doing this with a brush in a more sketchy way rather than just purely dry brushing the whole thing. And slowly but surely, as I worked across all of the different rocks and the areas and I built up my layers, I managed to match all of the rest of the base to the first test rock. And it all ended up looking something like this. Now all I had to do is make sure that the floor of the terrain matches these rocks. So I used all the same colours in roughly the same way and began to apply them to the floor. The one big main difference with the floor is that because it's a lot flatter than all the rocks, it's not going to have quite as much depth and deepness of the shadows because it doesn't have the same level of recesses. And in the end, I think that's a good thing because it will make the floor look different visually and distinct from the rocks on either side of it. Also, because the floor is much flatter, pure dry brushing was my main technique as I got to these lighter levels of highlights. After not very long, everything started to look like it was matching, but I think I needed to go just a little bit brighter with a highlight. So I decided that on the rocks, I would take an even brighter paint. I think I actually used a skin tone paint for this. And as I add this really final punchy highlight, you can see that it actually just starts to add a dryness to the colors and just really pops out all those edges, which I think makes this look just that little bit even cooler than it was. All those pros out there are not joking when they say push your contrast. I mean, you could just keep going brighter and brighter and, you know, it probably still look good. Well, until you get to close to pure white. So then with this newer brighter paint, I also wanted to do a dry brush on the floor to make sure that it matched the level of brightness with the rocks around it. And with that done, the core of our terrain is now painted. So now I've got to move on to the planks at the front of the floor. I didn't want to use an orangey brown wood here. I wanted a dry, dark wood, so I wanted to go for some brown grey tones. So I worked up layers from brigandine brown to brown grey and then warm grey, which gave me a really greyish wood tone that I don't think would have looked that good if I'd left it on its own. But what I decided to do after that was to use a little bit of Squig brown and then sepia ink to create colour variations and tones all over the different pieces of wood. And these effects were subtle, but that was fine, it didn't really matter. And what I would say the biggest factor in making these wood planks look better was to weather them and make them feel like they're part of the environment. If this is a dusty desert, then these planks would not have escaped getting loads of the dust on them. So I used my same colours that I used all over the rocks and I added them to the edges of these planks, and then I took it one step further and I even did a big dry brush with some of these lightest orangey browns over the top of the planks so that they really felt like they were embedded in this environment. And that's the planks done, so now there's only two other elements on this base left. One of those is the skulls and the other of those is the helmet. So I grabbed leather brown, bone white and off-white and began to do the skulls first. I gave them a base coat of the brown and then I used the bone white to cover about 80% of that following the direction of the light. And then I used off-white as pretty much an edge highlight and then a little dot highlight for the top of the heads. And that left me with some skulls that I was pretty happy with. They stood out slightly from the oranginess of the base with their own sort of cream colour, but they're not too stand out that they steal the show. For the helmets, it made sense to me to do this when I actually paint the armour on the Cadian later. So next up, it was time to think about the actual models that we're going to stick on top of this base, and the first one I wanted to paint up was the centerpiece, the forefront of this diorama, and that is the Cadian himself, Mr. Running Man. The first thing I painted on this character was his black details, so his boots and his neck thing. And then I painted Baneblade brown all over his fatigues. For the paints that I'm using, I'm basically using exactly the same as what the Evi archive suggests to use for Cadians, but I'm just not copying that heavy metal kind of line edge highlight style. I'm definitely using edge highlights, but I'm also trying to do this volumetric highlighting style that you'll see as I progress with the paint job. The armour got a base coat of Caliban green because I didn't have the other two greens that Evi archive suggests. And then because I didn't really own any of the other greens in between, I just started adding Nurgling green to Caliban green in order to work my way up with highlights. For the fatigues, I did a similar thing. I went from Baneblade to Carrack Stone, and then in the end, I added Ice Yellow to the mix just to make it brighter. All the leather parts got a base coat of Rhinox hide, and I pretty much did this similar to what the Evi archive said, except I did try and do some highlights with Carrack Stone as is suggested, but in the end, I prefer a warm leathery highlight for this, so you'll see I change it as I go. But with those initial base coats down, I've got something that looks like this. And it's time to just keep working away. So I did some small recess shading on the fatigues with Rhinox hide. Then highlighting, as I mentioned before, by adding Ice Yellow to my Carrack Stone. And just adding that in really small amounts on the parts that are directly facing the light. which I should say in this case I'm imagining coming in from a 45-degree angle from the right-hand side of this miniature. To enhance the armour, I began to work up from Nurgling Green all the way up to Krieg Khaki, which creates a massive jump in contrast from the original Caliban Green, so it gives a really good defining pop to all of the edges. To paint the leather materials on the Cadian, I decided to use Doombull Brown as per the recipe on Heavy Archive. Doombull Brown has this really nice richness to it that gives you a really nice warm leather colour. I really like it as a paint. I went even brighter on the highlight on the fatigues, going to an almost near white. Then I'm jumping around all over the place because I decided to go back to the green armour and add another edge highlight, going even brighter. Not sure if this is pure Krieg Khaki or if I added something to Krieg Khaki like Ice Yellow, but it's definitely one of the two. This was the perfect time to go back to the helmets on the base while I've got the green paints out and to paint those up. So I just copied them in the exact same style, moving from Caliban Green all the way up to Nurgling Green and then beyond to Krieg Khaki, and adding Ice Yellow to go brighter if it felt like it needed it. At this point, I deviated from the Heavy Archive recipe for painting Cadians because they recommend the leather to go up towards Karak Stone, which is like a sort of paler brown and more desaturated. And I like my leathers, especially on a Cadian guy like this, to be warm. So I moved up towards Scrag Brown, which is a pretty classic leathery recipe from Citadel Paints anyway. I think in the end, I did actually take the leather one step brighter and used Towlight Ochre for a final edge highlight as well. Then I painted up the skin, and I initially tried to go for a kind of tan skin. Then I worked in a bit of succubus skin paint from Vallejo Game Color to bring it into more of a reddish, pinkish hue to make it seem more like there's blood running under the skin. In the end, the recipe I was using basically ended up being pretty much the same as how I was painting the skin in my Pop Culture Faces video, which is the one just before the first part of this diorama. Faces are really tricky, but fortunately when they're this small, you can get away with just doing quite a bit of contrast on them. That can help to bring all the lines to life and bring out the detail. When I get around to painting my first bust, which I don't know when that will be, but hopefully one day on the channel, I'll probably have to work really hard on blending the tones on that face because the face will be so much bigger, it will need to look smoother to really sell it as a face. But anyway, after I'd highlighted up the cheekbones, the nose, the usual sort of facial features that catch the light, I decided to dot the eye with a little bit of black, and I got really lucky this time. I managed to do it first try, and it ended up looking really nice and neat. Then to highlight the shoes and the neck, I decided to use the paints that I'd used on the wooden planks on the base. They're perfect because they're brown and grey, so they will work really well on this dark leather that he has for his boots. So that was brown grey from AK 3rd Gen, and then warm grey from AK 3rd Gen. Then I wanted to paint his hair, so I used a dark brown on the back of his hair, and then on the front of his hair, where all the highlights will be, I used a lighter brown. The browns I used were from the Army Painter Fanatic range, from their hexad of brown paints. I think I started at Bootstrap Brown and worked all the way up to Paratrooper Brown. One of the last few details to work on were the bandages, so I did the bandages on his arm, and I was trying to use similar paints that I already had on my wet palette, so I think I used Baneblade Brown for the shadows, working up to Off-White for the highest highlights. Aside from the metals, which I've deliberately been leaving till last, I had to do the wooden handle of the axe. Once again, tapping into some of the browns that were already in my wet palette, but using different types together so that the brown looked different from, say, the leather. And with all that done, this is the miniature finished, except for the metals, which we're going to do all together with him and the squigs. So, talking about squigs, let's move on to painting those. I came up with this little recipe of paints, so I'm going to use heavy red as an opaque colour from Vallejo as my base coat, and then I'm going to add black to it to create shadow colours, and I'm going to build up to Scarlet Blood for my highlights, and if I need to go beyond Scarlet Blood for even brighter highlights, I'm going to use Tau Light Ochre. I began by putting my heavy red all over the squigs. Initially I was going to try and follow the zenithal priming that I'd done, but I just didn't in the end. I thought I'll just wing it and do the highlights after. With the initial coat of red down, I decided to base coat the teeth with a brown colour. I think it was the bootstrap brown. And I'm going to cover most of that brown up with a much lighter near white. Highlighting all of the squigs, I used a mix of my heavy red with Scarlet Blood from Vallejo, because Scarlet Blood is like the most saturated red paint I have. And I really love that saturation, so I love to use it in everything. And when you're highlighting red, you've got to be careful of shifting towards pink and orange. So shifting towards a more saturated red can be a really nice way to create highlights. If my highlights are coming from this side of the model, then the other side of the model would be in shadow. So adding black to my heavy red, I added in some shadow parts at the back of the squigs here. This shadow effect would end up being quite subtle because I didn't add that much black to this mixture, but it does add that little bit of extra definition here in the shadows at the back. And I just wanted to demonstrate that by holding a miniature that didn't have the shadows next to one that did. Moving now to the highlight side, I'm using a mixture with much more Scarlet Blood in it now, so it's a much more vibrant and bright red, and I'm adding that to all of the areas that are facing the light. Again, on this, to match the Cadian, it will be light coming from a 45-degree angle on the right-hand side. Adding Towlight Ochre gives you a nice warm orangey red highlight that I really like, and I just added a really small amount of that to all of the edges around the model. For now, I did leave it at this stage, but before this diorama was finished, I did end up going back to these squigs and adding pure Towlight Ochre to them as a really small, tiny dot highlight on all of their most prominent features, like the top of the eyebrows and the bits on the lips and nose. From what I can tell from my research online, squigs have yellow eyes most of the time, so I added in some yellow dots for those eyes using a nice bright yellow. All the squigs I could see had sort of pinkish gums and tongues, so I went in and painted those with some magenta paints next. The key thing when doing this kind of stuff is that as long as you take your magenta pinkish paint and you add a bunch of cream paint to it, so any kind of cream coloured paint like Screaming Skull or something like that, you will get a desaturated, much lighter highlight that you can use on these areas. For some reason, it just makes things look more fleshy by adding the creamy colour to them. Then it was time to do all the straps on the squigs for all the bits that they have to hold up all their explosives. And I started this in the same way that I did the Cadian leather with Rhinox hide, but deviated from that path, moving into the Army Painter Fanatics leathers because they're much more desaturated. I thought the Orc leather would be a lot less pristine and more beaten up than the Cadian. And for this, I began with edge highlights, but then moved to doing slightly volumetric highlights on these surfaces at the point where I thought the sun would be most parallel with these leather straps. Then it's teeth time, and I decided to paint them with off-white from Vallejo. And always painting the teeth on something like this is just a massive sort of bring it to life moment. The teeth are such a huge bright part of the model that it makes a massive difference once you've painted them. There were a few other little odd details around the squigs, but the main next part to paint was the metals. I used silver from Vallejo, and then I added black to it to get a darker base coat. I applied that all around my Cadian model, and then I used a wash of Nuln oil. But for my squigs, I did something different. I darkened my silver mix even more with some black paint, and then I added in a couple of drops of brown paint. This is Brigandine Brown from Army Painter Fanatic, and that would give this metal a slightly brownish, dirty hue. Similar to the leather parts, I didn't want the metal on the squigs to look exactly the same as the metal on the Cadian. It will be a subtle difference, but at least you and I will know that I did do it differently for the lore. To highlight these metal areas, it was just a case of adding more silver to the mix. The silver paint is extremely powerful from Vallejo, so it does a great job of really making those edges stand out. I went a little bit brighter with more silver for the Cadian and did his highlights all over his grenade and his axe and his other little metal parts, including the cup around the back. It was basically time to do final details on the painting, so I did a tiny bit of extra highlighting on the Cadian's hair, and then I increased the amount of red on the top of the squigs because they were looking a bit too dark overall, I think. And because this is a sunny environment, they needed to look brighter. Before I started gluing things, I decided to take some black primer and paint it all around the sides of the diorama so that we have a nice opaque black rim. Then one thing I had to make sure I did was to bring all of the small foot pieces and all of the squigs into line with all the rocks and the terrain on the rest of the diorama. I couldn't just stick them on and have them stand out like a sore thumb, so I went through and I just used the same paints that I used on all the rocks to basically paint these for an initial pass, but I would have to go and do that again when I actually stuck them to the model. So I started with the Cadian, and I knew I wanted his foot to be on one of the planks, and then I added each squig in turn in their respective places until I had a layout that I was happy with. Then to make the squig's base parts match the base, I had to use a bit of texture paste to fill any gaps, and then I had to repaint that with all the terrain colours as I did before. The final touches included adding some green grass tufts all around to give it that Zion National Park orange and green look, and then it was finished. Not bad for my first diorama, right? I don't want to sound too up myself, but I do generally really love this, and I think I did a cool job and I'm really happy with it. I hope you enjoyed seeing me build and paint this, and that you like the final result as much as I do. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to make dioramas every week here on the channel, but it's definitely something I will do more of in the future. I have so many good ideas for different videos, although not every video I can't buy new things and build epic new stuff like this. I am going to have to fall back on the things I already have for a while until my channel grows. But I love that this will always now be a part of my hobby history, something I made that I can always keep and enjoy looking at and be proud of. Support me with the good buttons below if you like this, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.